Let's just jump right into this explainer. Today, we're tackling a deeply sensitive, emotionally heavy, but honestly, absolutely vital set of official findings on group-based child sexual exploitation in the UK. We're strictly looking at the official government data, parliamentary statements, and that massive new rapid national audit to figure out exactly what happened, where things went so wrong, and ultimately what's actually being done about it now. To put this whole thing into perspective right off the bat, I want you to focus on this number, 9,000. That is the staggering number of historic child sex abuse cases the Metropolitan Police in London are now formally reviewing. As of October 2025, they're digging back in, actively hunting for overlooked evidence and those distinct patterns of grooming gang behavior. It's a massive, massive review, and it really sets the stage for the kind of systemic failure we're about to unpack.
Which brings us straight to the truly devastating conclusion from Baroness Louise Casey's rapid national audit. She found that institutions systematically failed to protect vulnerable kids. And the really shocking part? It wasn't just about a lack of funding. She literally called it a mix of blindness, ignorance, prejudice, defensiveness, and even good but misdirected intentions. Basically, a perfect storm that allowed a collective institutional failure to just take root. So to make sense of this, we're breaking the report down into 4 main areas. First, the scale of exploitation. Second, the institutional failures and denial. Third, the data, demographics, and scale. And finally, the recommendations and actions.
Section 1, the scale of exploitation, or what the report refers to as a stain on our society. The audit gets incredibly specific about exactly who these predators were targeting. We're talking about victims as young as 10 years old. These gangs frequently zeroed in on the absolute most vulnerable kids, those already in the care system, or kids with learning or physical disabilities. They'd ply them with drugs and alcohol to facilitate the abuse. The oversight here was so vast that over 800 previously dropped cases have already been reopened for review. And honestly, that number is fully expected to cross 1,000 pretty quickly. Now, the audit highlights this absolutely wild paradox. On one hand, police reports for child sexual abuse were actually going up. But at the exact same time, the number of kids getting child protection plans from social services for sexual abuse completely plummeted to a 30-year low. It's this massive systemic disconnect. The police are seeing the spike, but the social safety net that's literally designed to protect these kids was just shrinking its intake. Section 2, institutional failures and denial. Basically, 15 wasted years. So, how did this happen? Well, looking at this timeline against the backdrop of Parliament, you can see a brutal 15-year repeating cycle. It goes from the Monroe Review in 2010 to the J Report in Rotherham in 2014, the ICSA report in 2022, right up to the Casey Rapid Audit in 2025. A scandal breaks, there's public outrage, a government inquiry, and then nothing. No sustained improvement. The Casey report explicitly calls out this lost decade of systemic institutional failure across local agencies. But why the systemic denial? Well, Baroness Casey's exact findings are pretty unflinching here. The report states point blank that organizations avoided tackling this specific type of group-based exploitation for fear of appearing racist or raising community tensions. So energy was spent trying to downplay the issue rather than actually protecting kids, and that essentially gave predators a free pass to operate without any real consequences. And to make matters worse, the justice system totally failed to treat children like children. The audit found this horrifying trend where 13 to 15-year-olds were having their cases dropped or downgraded from rape to lesser charges. Why? Because authorities actually perceived these young teenagers to have consented or to be in love with adult abusers. Instead of treating them as victims of intense grooming, the system essentially treated them as if they were complicit in their own abuse. Section 3. Data, demographics, and scale. It's time to face the facts. Now, when you try to map this out, you quickly realize the national data is frankly a mess. The Casey audit confirms that for 2/3 of group-based child sexual exploitation perpetrators nationally, ethnicity data simply isn't recorded. The system has constantly failed to collect the most basic information needed to track these networks. And that's despite 13 solid years of warnings that this massive data gap was keeping authorities completely in the dark. But where local forces actually did their jobs and collected the data properly, like we see here in West Yorkshire's records between 2020 and 2024, a very stark picture emerges. In that region, 35% of suspects were of an Asian ethnic background, even though they only make up 16% of the local population. On the flip side, white suspects made up 34% of suspects, but 77% of the population. The audit objectively points out this highly disproportionate overrepresentation in the regional data.
And we see this confirmed by the National Crime Agency's own data. Take Operation Stovewood in Rotherham. Out of 323 designated suspects, 64% were recorded as being of a Pakistani ethnic background. Now, the audit makes it very clear that offenders absolutely come from all backgrounds: white British, European, African, Middle Eastern. But it stresses that in these specific regional investigations, we can't ignore the hard data showing this distinct overrepresentation.
So what about the other side of the equation, the victims? If we look at official police records from Greater Manchester covering 35 different exploitation operations up to May 2025, out of 317 known victims, 298 of them, that's 94%, were white. So the data firmly establishes that in these specific, high-profile operations, the overwhelming majority of the victims being targeted were vulnerable white girls.
Which brings us to Section 4, Recommendations and Action. Let's look at the path to accountability.
Right. So the government has stepped up and announced they're immediately implementing all 12 of Baroness Casey's recommendations. And these are sweeping changes. The National Crime Agency is completely overhauling their operations, so local forces finally treat grooming gangs as serious organized crime. They're passing a mandatory reporting duty into the Crime and Policing Bill. The law is literally changing so that an adult having penetrative sex with anyone under 16 faces a mandatory rape charge, completely shutting down that whole complicit excuse. Plus, police are now legally required to collect ethnicity data, and convicted sex offenders are going to be explicitly excluded from the UK asylum system.
We're also seeing fast, localized action. The London Assembly, for example, just passed a motion to immediately form an exploitation board run by the Mayor's Office for Policing and Crime. They're dropping £1.5 million into the 2026/27 budget to develop best practice interventions. And the crucial part? This is actually going to be guided by the insights of victims and survivors to create a brand new London-wide exploitation prevention strategy.
Which brings us to the end of this explainer and leaves us with one massive question. The government has issued an unequivocal apology to these victims, and they're promising a new national statutory inquiry to basically force local agencies to cooperate and stop hiding. But as we saw in that timeline earlier, promises have been made before. Will this unprecedented wave of government action, statutory inquiries, and hard legal mandates finally break that 15-year cycle of denial? Let's hope it actually delivers true justice. Thanks for walking through this really heavy but important data with us today. Keep asking those tough questions, and we'll catch you in the next explainer.